And it's been a big week in Canberra. The politicians took their long break and then came back for the budget. And last night we saw the budget reply speech from Labor opposition leader Anthony Albanese, providing, I guess, the alternate budget to what the federal government put forward on Tuesday night through Treasurer Josh Frydenberg. And our Canberra correspondent John McDonnell writes at flownews24.com.au under the headline Labor's Pitch for Government that yet again we've seen another big multi-billion-dollar fund promoted by Labor. This one's a $10 billion Housing Australia Future Fund. Now, before I go into that policy, let's just look back at the other funds that Labor's promised in recent times. Before the budget, they said that they would create a National Reconstruction Fund. That's about $15 billion to help invest into manufacturing around the nation. And in the October speech that they gave when there was a delayed budget because of the pandemic, and so it's only been 7 months since the last budget reply speech, but in that speech they outlined a $40 billion Rewiring the Nation Fund, which is about basically sending the energy grid in opposite directions to where it used to go, because renewable energy is largely being generated in regional areas, including in our broadcast areas, and being sent back to the large metropolitan areas where there's much higher energy demand. And controversially, as we spoke about with the local Labor member Catherine King in the seat of Ballarat, that means that high transmission electricity lines are going to go over some prime agricultural land, and some farmers have quite bluntly, on the paintings on the side of their sheds, expressed their messages of disgust towards the proponents of that project and the local member herself. But I think that Mr Albanese will get a much warmer reception to this policy about social housing if it does actually deliver housing in the regions. We've been covering this issue of the shortage of housing for people on low incomes and those who are down and out in the recent weeks. Almost every time we speak to a mayor or a local politician, this issue comes up independently. There has been a tree change or a vine change, or just people wanting to get out of the cities. They've headed out to the country areas to get away perhaps from the congestion and the closer quarters that people have to live in during a pandemic. Maybe they don't want to wear face masks or be subjected to lockdowns. So they've headed to the regions and they've found they can't find somewhere to live. And then there's been a jobs boom in the regions, but attracting workers has become difficult because there's nowhere for those workers to live. Mr Albanese's policy, as John McDonnell reports on flownews24.com.au, will build 20,000 social houses a year if they're elected to government, but they also want to build 10,000 affordable homes for frontline workers such as nurses, police and cleaners, who Mr Albanese describes as the heroes of the pandemic. And the pandemic certainly has recast the debate when it comes to what we do as a nation. We don't have international visitors or international students or indeed immigrants who are coming to the country to compete in our labour market for jobs with our young people and unemployed and those that have been retrenched and the like. And herein I think Labor does have 2 winners out of 3 in the policy funds that I've suggested. I think the housing fund is going to work well for them with voters. The manufacturing one is huge. I think that is something the Australian public wants to see, is Australia making more things. I think the more Mr Albanese talks about that, the more head nods he gets. But the Rewiring the Nation policy, I think, is a stinker in our regional areas, though it will probably work well for him in the metropolitan area where renewable energy and all the good feelings about that, where the wind turbines and the solar farms are out of sight, out of mind. I think that those votes will pick up for them in the city. So the funds probably are all going to work electorally for Mr Albanese. But I spotted a cartoon in The Australian this week that I thought was quite telling. It's a Scooby-Doo cartoon, which shows the Scooby-Doo gang, and they've pulled the Josh Frydenberg fake mask off of the head of the Treasurer, and lo and behold, it's Wayne Swan underneath, the Labor Treasurer. And Wayne Swan's saying, "I would have got away with it if it wasn't for you pesky kids." It's something Wayne Phillips and I have discussed on the program this week, that this budget is very much a Labor-style budget from the coalition, and to some extent I think Mr Albanese would have envied a lot of what was in the federal budget because it was the kind of stuff Labor would have liked to do themselves. An election's due in the mid to late parts of next year, so the pandemic politics may well not play as well for Mr Morrison as it has for state premiers in recent elections. It's quite possible the voters' report card will be on the Morrison government's handling of the recovery from the pandemic rather than protecting them from the virus itself.